It's 1879, and you are, well, you're deep in the heartland of South Africa.
The heat is just stifling.
Exactly. Imagine standing behind this hastily assembled barricade of heavy grain sacks, overturned, splintering wagons everywhere. The air is thick with the smell of dust and sweat.
And you are one of just 150 exhausted, terrified British soldiers.
Yeah, and marching toward you, rolling across the plains, sounding literally like a steam train in the distance, is this elite force of 4,000 fiercely proud Zulu warriors.
Just chanting in perfect unison.
Smashing their short stabbing spears against their massive cowhide shields.
Yeah.
And there is absolutely nowhere to run.
The sheer psychological weight of that moment is it's paralyzing.
Completely.
You're watching this overwhelming tidal wave of human force bearing down on your fragile little wall of bags and wood, knowing that within minutes, it's going to be a brutal hand-to-hand fight for survival.
Welcome to today's Deep Dive. I'm your host, and that terrifying scenario isn't just, some Hollywood set piece.
No, it's the stark reality of the Battle of Rorke's Drift. And I'm your resident expert for today's deep dive. I'm really excited to get into this one.
Me too. Because today, our mission is to basically tear apart the legendary 1964 film Zulu.
Right, to see how a piece of classic cinema managed to capture the raw courage of two completely different warring empires.
And where it brilliantly bent the truth for the sake of drama. Because, we are looking at a massive clash of worlds here.
Absolutely. On one side, you have this technologically advanced British military aggressively expanding its borders.
And then on the other, an indigenous civilization whose entire culture was built around military prowess. Like a society people often compare to the ancient Spartans.
Which is why this matters so much for you listening right now. It's not just about old battles. It's a masterclass in how understanding multiple perspectives and seeing past our own hubris can completely change how we view a conflict.
Exactly. So to really grasp the gravity of that barricade, we kind of have to rewind a bit. Look at the powder keg that put those men there in the first place.
Right, because this wasn't just a sudden, unprovoked clash. For quite a while, there was actually an uneasy but functioning truce in South Africa between the expanding British and the Zulu kingdom.
The British actually recognized them as a sovereign power, right?
They did. They allowed them to continue their way of life.
Yeah.
But that peace shattered over something buried in the dirt, like 800 miles away.
Diamonds.
Precisely. The discovery of diamonds in Kimberley completely changed the economic calculus for the British.
Suddenly, it's not just a strategic outpost anymore.
Right, it's a treasure trove. Pressed by white settlers and colonial administrators who were eyeing all that untapped wealth, the British decided the Zulu kingdom was an obstacle.
They needed a war.
They needed a war, but they needed it to look justified.
Which begs the question, how do you manufacture a justified war with a neighbor who isn't currently attacking you?
Well, you deliver an ultimatum designed to be rejected. The British sent this 13-term demand to the Zulu king, Cetshwayo, giving him just 20 days to comply. And the centerpiece of this ultimatum, they demanded the Zulus entirely disband their army and dissolve their regiment system.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because on paper, disbanding an army sounds like a fairly standard, if aggressive, treaty demand. Why was that such a guaranteed trigger for war?
Because the Zulu regiment system, the Amabutho, wasn't just a standing army like the British had. It was the absolute core of their social fabric.
It was their entire way of life.
Exactly. Around the age of 14, young Zulu boys were conscripted and sent to military kraals. They lived there, they trained there, they swore loyalty to the king. This system dictated everything, even when a man was allowed to marry.
Wait, really?
Yeah, you couldn't take a wife until the king granted your specific regiment permission, which was usually after years of service or, proving yourselves in battle.
It's almost like, think of a hostile corporate takeover. But instead of just liquidating assets, the acquiring company demands you fire all your employees, burn your headquarters, and completely erase your corporate culture in 20 days.
That is a fascinating analogy.
It's an ultimatum where the only acceptable answer is the voluntary destruction of your own society. It's intentionally designed to fail so they can justify the buyout.
That is the perfect way to look at it. The sheer arrogance of the imperial mindset at the time meant the British never expected compliance. They didn't want it.
So when those 20 days ran out,
and King Cetshwayo rightfully ignored the demand to destroy his own culture, the British had their excuse. Lord Chelmsford invaded Zululand at the head of 12,000 men.
12,000, that's a massive force.
It is, and he was so confident in his modern military machine that he genuinely thought his biggest problem was going to be getting the Zulus to actually stand and fight.
He assumed they would use what? Guerrilla tactics? Take a few shots and melt away into the hills to avoid a pitched battle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which leads directly to one of the most disastrous military decisions in history. Chelmsford splits his forces.
Never split the party.
Right. He takes the bulk of his army deeper into Zululand, hunting for this decisive battle, and leaves about 1,500 troops behind to make a temporary camp at an open plain called Izanlawana.
But even if he split his forces, the British had modern breech-loading rifles, they had artillery. The Zulus were armed primarily with spears and cowhide shields. Why couldn't a force of 1,500 British soldiers just hold off whatever they encountered?
Because superior firepower only works if you have the time and the sightlines to use it.
Oh, right.
At 8 in the morning the following day, British scouts were patrolling a nearby valley. They chased a few Zulus over a ridge and accidentally stumbled into a ravine where the entire main Zulu army had been sitting in total silence.
Just completely hidden from view. And we're talking, what, 20,000 warriors?
20,000. And the moment they were discovered, they didn't retreat. They rose up and immediately launched an overwhelming offensive. The psychological shock to the British was absolute.
I mean, imagine holding a 10-pound Martini Henry rifle. It fires this massive, heavy lead bullet that causes devastating damage.
But it relies on something called volley fire to be effective against large numbers.
Right, where they spread out into 3 ranks. The first rank fires, the second prepares, the third reloads. It creates a continuous rolling wall of lead.
But that machine-like rigid European approach completely falls apart if the enemy doesn't line up neatly in front of you.
Right.
Plus, the Martini Henry fired black powder cartridges.
Ah, so the smoke.
After a few volleys, the air was completely choked with thick, blinding white smoke. The rifles overheated so badly that the barrels would literally blister the soldiers' hands.
Wow.
And bursting through that blinding smoke was an enemy utilizing a brilliant tactical maneuver pioneered by Shaka Zulu decades earlier, the horns of the buffalo.
Okay, wait. How does an army of 20,000 coordinate a complex flanking maneuver across miles of chaotic, smoke-filled battlefield without radios?
Through intense, lifelong discipline and visual communication, the tactic is terrifyingly effective. The chest of the buffalo, the strongest veteran warriors, charges straight up the middle to lock the enemy in brutal frontal combat.
So the British are entirely focused on surviving that frontal assault.
Exactly. And while they're distracted, the younger, faster warriors, the horns, sprint out for miles on the left and right flanks. They use the terrain, dipping into ravines and tall grass, completely encircling the enemy in total silence until the trap snaps shut.
And Shaka Zulu had fundamentally changed how they fought once they closed that circle, right? Like, they weren't throwing spears from a distance.
No, Shaka had realized that throwing your weapon away was a terrible idea. He introduced the ikwa, a short, heavy-bladed stabbing spear. It forced close quarters, hand-to-hand butchery.
That is horrifying.
By the time the British at Izanlawana realized the horns had wrapped around them, their rigid firing lines were broken. The camp was utterly annihilated. It goes down in history as the worst defeat ever suffered by a modern, technologically advanced army against an indigenous force.
Which brings us back to that terrifying sound of the train in the distance. The survivors of Izanlawana are dead, and a massive splinter force of 4,000 Zulus breaks off and heads straight for the tiny, isolated supply depot at Rorke's Drift.
Defended by just 150 men.
Right, and this is the exact moment the 1964 film Zulu drops us into.
And we really have to consider the incredible tightrope this movie walked. I mean, it was released in 1964. The Civil Rights Act hadn't even been passed in the United States yet.
And they filmed it in South Africa, right?
Yes, right where apartheid was, at its absolute zenith. The political climate was deeply segregated and steeped in racial prejudice.
You would completely expect a movie made in that environment to be, well, a straightforward propaganda piece. Like, the standard script would be to show heroic, civilized white men fighting a horde of nameless, barbaric savages.
But the film outright refuses to do that. It actively subverts those expectations.
Yeah.
There is a concerted, deliberate effort to humanize the Zulus and present them with immense dignity.
It's incredible for its time.
It really is.
Yeah.
The movie doesn't have a mustache-twirling arch-villain on either side. It just shows the brutal reality of soldiers caught in the meat grinder of empire.
There is this fantastic moment early in the film that perfectly captures this respect. A character makes a dismissive, racist remark, calling the Zulus a bunch of savages, and another character immediately shuts him down, pointing out the physical reality of what they're facing.
Right, he asks something like, how far can your regiment march in a day?
Exactly. He says 15, 20 miles. The Zulu regiment can run 50 miles and fight a battle at the end of it.
It demands the audience respect the adversary. It strips away the myth of British superiority before the first shot is even fired at the barricades.
Let's talk about how the film strips away the romantic notion of war through its two main characters, too. We have Lieutenant John Chard, played by Stanley Baker, and Lieutenant Bromhead, played by Michael Caine. How do these two men embody the collapse of that Victorian military arrogance?
Their dynamic is such a brilliant psychological study. They represent two entirely different ideals of the British Empire.
Right, Chard is a royal engineer.
He's pragmatic, down to earth, and he earned his rank through technical expertise. He's literally building a bridge at the start of the movie, perfectly comfortable working in the mud alongside his men.
And then there's Bromhead, complete opposite.
Bromhead is an infantry officer and a pure aristocrat. He comes from a highly prestigious military lineage.
Constantly reminding everyone that his father was at Waterloo.
Yes, and his great-grandfather fought at Quebec. He struts around playing the role of the pompous, proper gentleman officer who thinks a chap ought to look smart and maintain rigid social hierarchy, even in the middle of nowhere.
But when that wave of 4,000 warriors appears on the horizon, we see Bromhead's facade just crack. He realizes that having a great-grandfather who fought at Quebec does absolutely nothing to stop an Ickles spear.
The terror of the situation forces him to admit his own deep insecurities. He actually confesses to Chard that despite his family name, he's never actually seen combat.
He says, "You're the professional, I'm the amateur."
Exactly. Facing utter annihilation at Rorke's Drift evaporates all of their social status. The glorious painting-on-the-wall notion of war is just thrown out the window. The only way they survive the next 24 hours is by abandoning their egos and relying entirely on each other.
So the battle begins, and this is where the physical reality of Rorke's Drift is so vastly different from Isondawana. Why didn't the Zulus just use the horns of the buffalo to encircle and crush this tiny outpost like they did hours earlier?
Because the terrain dictated the tactics. Isondawana was an open plain. Rorke's Drift was a tight, fortified mission station.
And Chard used his engineering background.
He did. He had his men build defensive walls out of heavy 200-pound mealie bags, grain sacks, and overturned biscuit tin wagons. The horns couldn't circle them because they were forced to attack a fortified wall.
They funneled the Zulus into narrow avenues of approach.
Precisely. The barricades turned the open ground into highly contained kill zones, and that is where the British volley fire system, which failed so spectacularly in the open at Isondawana, became horrifyingly effective.
Right, because the Zulus couldn't outmaneuver it.
It created these concentrated, inescapable streams of lead that inflicted horrendous casualties on the charging Zulus.
It turns into an exhausting, bloody, day and night nightmare. Men are fighting hand-to-hand over the barricades with bayonets and short spears. And right when the British are completely physically and emotionally drained, waiting for what looks like the final fatal charge, the movie delivers its most iconic, surreal scene.
The sing-off.
The sing-off. The fighting pauses. The Zulus mass on the hills surrounding the station. And they start singing. This massive, intimidating, beautifully harmonized war chant echoing across the valley.
It's a psychological tactic to break the last of the defenders' morale.
Exactly. But instead of breaking, Lieutenant Chard looks at his men and essentially says, "You think the Welsh can't do better than that?"
They joke about having a good bass section but lacking top tenors.
Yeah. And then the exhausted British soldiers start singing back. They belt out the Welsh battle hymn, Men of Harlech. It turns into this incredible, surreal sing-off across a battlefield covered in bodies. Two entirely alien worlds, locked in mortal combat, united for a brief moment by the sheer power of the human voice.
It built up an incredible amount of tension, leading directly into the film's completely unexpected ending.
Right, because after hours more of brutal fighting, the British are out of ammunition. They are on their last legs, holding bayonets, waiting to be wiped out. But the Zulus don't attack.
Instead, they raise their spears and applaud the British.
They salute them as fellow braves, recognizing them as worthy, courageous warriors who stood their ground. They develop this profound mutual respect, turn around, and peacefully retreat.
It's an incredibly powerful moment in the film.
Okay, I have to know, though. The sing-off, the mutual salute. Did two warring empires really just stop the butchery to have a choral battle and tip their hats to each other?
Not a chance. The historical reality was very different.
Wait, really? That entire beautiful moment of mutual respect is entirely fabricated by Hollywood.
It is entirely a product of cinematic storytelling. The sing-off never happened, and the Zulus certainly didn't salute the British and leave out of deep admiration for their bravery.
It's almost like, you know when a painter does a portrait? A cold, perfectly accurate photograph gives you the exact dimensions of a person's face. But sometimes a painter will slightly exaggerate a feature, the intensity of the eyes, the slump of the shoulders, and somehow that stylized, inaccurate painting reveals more about the subject's inner soul than the photograph ever could.
That is a brilliant way to frame it.
Yeah. The film fabricated the facts to capture the emotional truth of how deeply these men had to dig to find their courage.
Exactly. Because the photograph, the actual historical truth of why the Zulus retreated, is far more tragic and steeped in irony.
Why did they leave if not out of respect?
They retreated because they saw a massive British relief column marching toward the station. But here is the ultimate tragedy of Rorke's drift. Those 4,000 Zulus shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Wait, what do you mean?
King Cetshwayo had explicitly ordered his commanders not to attack the outpost.
He ordered them to stay away, even after completely crushing the British at Isandlwana.
Because Cetshwayo was a pragmatic leader. He knew he couldn't win a prolonged war against the entire British Empire. His goal at Isandlwana was to deliver a bloody nose, to state unequivocally that he was defending his homeland from an unprovoked invasion.
He wanted to force them to the negotiating table.
Right. By attacking a fortified supply depot on the border, he knew the Zulus would be framed as the aggressors.
So the warriors at Rorke's drift went rogue.
They were a reserve force that hadn't seen action at Isandlwana. They were frustrated, they were hungry for glory, and they made a disastrous tactical error. Think about the irony here. The British were annihilated at Isandlwana because Chelmsford vastly underestimated the Zulus.
Right.
But the Zulus were decimated at Rorke's Drift because they vastly underestimated the entrenched British. And by ignoring their king's orders and attacking that outpost, they handed the British Empire the exact excuse it needed.
The British public was outraged by Isandlwana, but inspired by Rorke's drift.
Exactly. And the government used that to justify a full-scale, ruthless reinvasion that ultimately destroyed the Zulu kingdom.
Wow. So what does this all mean for us today? When you look at the end of the film Zulu, despite those historical fabrications like the sing-off, there is a profound, heavy anti-war sentiment. There are no cheers of victory when the Zulus retreat over the hills. The British soldiers are traumatized.
They are completely hollowed out. In the final scenes, one character asks another how he feels, and the response is a quiet, devastated, sick. He says he feels ashamed at the butchery.
The film completely refuses to revel in the glory of the British Empire. It strips away the medals and the uniforms and just presents the horrific cost of the conflict on the human soul.
Which is why it's so enduring.
Yeah.
Empathizing with the mechanics of survival on both sides of a barricade is always harder, but infinitely more rewarding than just cheering for a flag.
Exactly. Put yourself in their shoes for a moment. Whether you are the 14-year-old Zulu boy drafted into a system that demands you run 50 miles into machine gun fire to defend your homeland, or the terrified British engineer hiding behind a wall of grain sacks, praying your rifle doesn't jam.
It changes how you view history.
It does. When you take the time to humanize both sides of a conflict, when you strip away the cartoonish villains and look at the tactile, terrifying reality of survival, you walk away with a much deeper understanding of how history is actually forged.
Absolutely.
So I want to leave you with a final thought today, something to mull over. We established that the movie invented that beautiful sing-off. It invented the mutual salute of respect between these two warring factions. Those were completely fictional moments created by a screenwriter in 1964. Yet somehow that fiction feels more resonant, more morally and emotionally true than the cold, hard, tragic facts of a rogue attack and an approaching relief column.
It really does.
If a movie can do that, if a fabricated moment can teach us more about human courage, dignity, and the tragedy of war than a perfectly accurate historical ledger, how much of the history we hold dear today, the stories we use to define ourselves and our nations, is actually just brilliant storytelling? The next time you picture a historical battle, ask yourself, are you hearing the true history, or are you just hearing the sound of a train in the distance?